First, I would like to begin by thanking the Friends of the Brighton Library for their work in bringing together this book review series. I'm Michael Miller. My background includes practicing law for 50 years in Rochester. During that time, I served for 16 years as a councilman here in the town of Brighton, 2 years as chairman of the Monroe County Democratic Committee, and 10 years as Monroe County Family Court Judge. The book I am going to review is CASTE, The Origins of Our Discontent by Isabel Wilkerson. She is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist for the New York Times and author of a prior book, The Warmth of Other Suns, the story of the migration of African Americans from the South to the North. CASTE is her most recent book. One reviewer called it an instant American classic. It has spent months on the New York Times nonfiction bestseller list. When I looked this week, it was number 7 out of the 10 best-selling nonfiction books. It was also an Oprah Winfrey Book of the Month Club selection. So impressed was she that she ordered 500 copies of the book and distributed them to leading educators and public office holders throughout the United States. One word of caution before I begin the review. If you are looking for entertainment or light reading, please save your money. Under no circumstances buy this book. At best, it will leave you very uncomfortable, and at worst, it will leave you very depressed. Wilkerson compares the caste system of African Americans in the United States to the untouchables of India and the plight of Jews under the Nazi regime in Germany. The latter link is the weakest part of her book. While she explains how the Nazis based their laws of racial purity, Aryan superiority, and the separation of Jews from the rest of society on Jim Crow laws, their ultimate goal was the destruction and elimination of the Jewish people. Destruction and elimination of African Americans and the untouchables was never the intent of the caste system in the United States or India. Indeed, as the author points out, maintenance of the lowest class was necessary because the caste system demanded that there be a bottom rung of the societal ladder by which others measured themselves. Wilkerson quotes the Yale scholar Lyndon in 1942 as saying that the mill worker, with nobody else to look down on, regards himself as eminently superior to the Negro. The colored man represents his last outpost against social oblivion. The object of the caste system, Wilkerson goes on to say, was to have the underclass be subject to being employed in the most menial labor, kept separate from other classes, and looked down upon with scorn and contempt. As an example of the similarity of the caste system in India and the United States, Wilkerson cites the example of Martin Luther King Jr. during his trip to India. Visiting a group of high school students whose families had been untouchables, the principal made this introduction. "Young people," he said, "I would like to present to you a fellow untouchable from the United States." King was floored. He had not expected that term to be applied to him. He was in fact put off by it at first. He had flown in from another continent, had dined with the Prime Minister. He did not see the connection, did not see what the Indian caste system had to do directly with him, did not immediately see why the lowest class people in India would view him, an American Negro and a distinguished visitor, as low caste like themselves, see him as one of them. For a moment, he wrote, I was a bit shocked and peeved that I would be referred to as an untouchable. Then he began to think about the reality of the lives of people he was fighting for. 20 million people consigned to the lowest rank in America for centuries, still smothering in an airtight cage of poverty, quarantined in isolated ghettos, exiled in their own country. And he said to himself, yes, I am an untouchable, and every Negro in the United States of America is an untouchable. The two fields where the U.S. caste system allowed for African Americans to succeed are athletics and entertainment, and even there they were not permitted to be thought of as higher class. As LeBron James, the basketball star and the most recognizable athlete of our time, and recently honored as Time Magazine's Athlete of the Year, pointed out, no matter how wealthy you become, how people worship you, or what you do, if you are an African American, you will always be that. The roots of the caste system in America go back to 1619, when the first cargo of African slaves were delivered by boat to the Virginia colony. Other immigrants came to America in search of a better life or to escape religious persecution. Africans were brought to America against their will, in chains, auctioned off like animals, forced to work for no wages, and subject to the harshest and most barbaric treatment. If other immigrants suffered from ethnic prejudice, they could always change their names. African Americans could not change their skin color. Abraham Lincoln declared that the nation could not survive half free and half slave. A civil war was fought at the cost of 750,000 lives, and the slaves were finally emancipated. During the post-Civil War period, known as Reconstruction, attention was paid to the status of African Americans, and some even sought and were elected to public office. But soon, the federal government abandoned Reconstruction and gave power back to the hands of those who had fought for the South in the Civil War. Wilkerson points out how whites quickly gained complete control, and organizations such as the Ku Klux Klan were formed to keep the Negroes in their place. Wilkerson goes into excruciating detail about the method used by white citizens to ensure the subjugation of the Negro race. Lynchings were commonplace and became huge public spectacles, advertised in local newspapers and attended by men, women, and even children. The lynchings were often preceded by torturing the victims before hanging, and photographs of the scenes were widely distributed. From 1878 till 1934, there were 187 lynchings, and that, my friends, was in the state of Kentucky alone. Anti-lynching laws were introduced in Congress, but all were defeated by Southern filibusters. Jim Crow laws were passed in the South, prohibiting mingling of the races and blacks from entering certain occupations. The pillars of the caste system survived the emancipation and remained intact. In 1944, the public school system in Columbus, Ohio, decided to hold an essay contest, challenging students to consider the question, what to do with Hitler after the war. A 16-year-old African-American girl thought about what should befall Hitler. She won the essay contest with a single sentence. put him in black skin, and let him live the rest of his life in America. 4 seismic events occurred in American history, which many felt might signal the beginning of the end of the caste system. In physics, however, for every action, there is a reaction. And in civic life, regrettably, the same holds true. The first action was a Supreme Court case in 1954, Brown versus Board of Education, which held that separate but equal facilities were inherently unequal and ordered an end with all deliberate speed to segregated schools. The reaction to that decision was outrage in the South, where U.S. Marshals and National Guard forces had to be used to escort black children into previously segregated schools. And some went so far as to abolish public schools completely and replace them with private educational systems in order to preserve segregation. Similarly, when busing was ordered to integrate schools in the North, the outcry was such that most mandatory busing schemes were abandoned. Today, because the majority of black citizens live in poverty and isolated ghettos, and the neighborhood schools still exist, most schools are still segregated, in fact, if not in law. The second action was the signing of the Civil Rights Act into law by Lyndon Johnson, which promised to promote equal rights for all groups, but particularly African Americans. Johnson said upon signing the law that the Democratic Party would lose the Southern vote for a generation. That was an understatement. The reaction to the enactment of the law in the more than 1/2 century since, no Democrat has ever won the majority of the white vote nationally. People were murdered in attempts to make the law live up to its premises. For example, young men like Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney were killed in Mississippi for trying to register African Americans to vote. So infamous was the incident that it gave birth to a Hollywood movie called Mississippi Burning, which won many awards. Third, the presidential victory of Barack Obama in 2008 was heralded as the beginning of a post-racial era in America. The reaction, as Wilkerson observes, was that the symbolism of Obama's victory was a profound loss of status to white citizens. Only 43% of white voters voted for Obama in 2008, and fewer still, 39% voted for him in 2012. CASTE gives insight, says Wilkerson, into the Democrats' wishful yearning for white working-class voters who they believe should respond in higher numbers to their kitchen table appeals. Why were they voting against their best interests? In fact, they were actually voting in their own interests. Maintaining the caste system as it existed has always been in their interest. They were willing to accept short-term discomfort, forego health insurance, risk contamination of water and air, and even die to protect their long-term interests in the hierarchy as they knew it. In 2016, President Trump was ushered into office by whites concerned over their status. His political priorities were plainly aimed at both protecting the racial hierarchy and strengthening its boundaries. Says Wilkerson, the voters were people who felt that the rug was being pulled out from under them, that the benefits they enjoy because of their race their group's advantages, and their status atop the racial hierarchy were all in jeopardy. As Satchel Paige, the great Negro pitcher, who because of the color barrier was not allowed in the major leagues until he was in his 40s, once famously said, "Never look behind you. Someone may be catching up." And that is exactly what motivated many white voters. They looked behind them, and someone, namely African Americans, were catching up. There was a fourth event that occurred, and this event happened after this book was published. So the views expressed here are not that of Miss Wilkerson, the author, but are my views alone, and of course do not necessarily reflect the views of the author. The incident was the murder of George Floyd while in police custody and the subsequent Black Lives Matter movement. Peaceful voters, peaceful protests with blacks and whites marching together was an inspiration to many Americans. It seemed as if finally the caste barriers were being broken down and whites realized what blacks in America went through. But the line was crossed, and in many instances, violence, looting, arson, and the rest were done in cities and all across the country. The result was backlash was overwhelming to condemn this violence. A Chicago leader of the Black Lives Matter demonstration even stated that looting was justified as a form of reparations. The protesters who turned to violence did not recognize the famously prophetic and haunting words of Abraham Lincoln. Those who would take an appeal from the ballot to the bullet will surely lose their case. Republican ads focused upon the violence in the demonstrations, and they showed graphic pictures of it. It was perhaps one of the most effective political advertisements of all times. Look at the down ballot races. Republicans did much better than expected, and Democrats had high hopes of increasing their majority in the House of Representatives, but instead, they now have a razor-thin majority, having lost many seats that were won in the previous election. It was hoped by Democrats, and they had high hopes of taking over the Senate majority, but these too were crushed as the Senate races for the Democrats did not live up to expectations. Again, action and reaction. Finally, it is doubtful whether Black Lives Matter movement did more good than harm, and it did account for the major backlash. Wilkerson goes on to give several examples of indignities she sustained by virtue of being an African American woman. For example, while doing a story for the New York Times, she had called ahead to schedule an interview with a prominent businessman in Chicago. When she arrived for the interview at the appointed time, she was asked to prove who she was. Regrettably, she had not brought her business cards with her. The man refused to be interviewed because he was convinced that an African American woman could not possibly be a journalist for the New York Times. On a personal note, an African American friend of mine related how very proud he was that his daughter had become a physician. But he told me that on more than one occasion, while walking the corridors of the hospital where she worked, she was told that a room needed cleaning. Apparently, the people who made the request of her automatically assumed that she was a member of the cleaning staff. At the very end of the book, Wilkerson gives some reason for hope. A white plumber comes to her house to repair a water leak in the cellar. His attitude upon seeing that she was an African American was cold and hostile. In an attempt to break the ice, she told him that her mother had just passed away. He stopped what he was doing and related that his mother had also recently passed away. Suddenly, they had a common bond, the human losses we all suffer, no matter what race we are. The visit by the plumber went smoothly after that, each treating and recognizing the other as a human being. Jackie Robinson, who suffered so many indignities as he broke the color barrier to Major League Baseball, said, "I am not concerned with your liking or disliking me. All I ask is that you respect me as a human being." John F. Kennedy, in his famous speech at American University, put it this way: "For in the final analysis, our most common link is that we all inhabit the small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's future, and we are all mortal. When we all see each other as fellow human beings, instead of being seen first as people of different races, that the American caste system may begin to come to an end." In conclusion, Isabel Wilkerson has written an excellent book, meticulously researched, examining the caste system in America, its history, and of what lies just beneath the surface of American society. For serious students of American history, this book is a must-read.
It's good, honey.